The grandfather clock in the corner struck 11 times, each chime echoing through the empty cabin like a distant church bell, calling the faithful to prayer. Jacob Thornhill sat at the rough-hewn table, the oil lamp casting flickering shadows across the ledger, where he tracked every bushel of wheat, every cord of wood, every dollar that passed through his calloused hands. His 640 acres of Colorado land demanded meticulous records. The Homestead Act of 1862 had given him this opportunity, but keeping it required proof of continuous improvement, proof of purpose, proof of life. Beside the ledger sat a tintype photograph in a tarnished silver frame. Catherine smiled out from the image, frozen forever at 28, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of 5-year-old Samuel. The boy held a small iron horse that Jacob had forged for his 3rd birthday. 3 years had passed since consumption had stolen Catherine's breath, since diphtheria had claimed Samuel just 2 days later. 3 years since Jacob had dug 2 graves on the hill behind the house, his hands blistering raw in the winter rain as he carved out their final resting place in the frozen earth. The memory came unbidden, as it always did in the quiet hours. Samuel running across this very floor, his small boots thundering like a herd of wild mustangs, shouting, "Papa! Papa, you're home!" Jacob could still feel the weight of that small body launching into his arms after 3 days spent checking trap lines in the high country. Could still hear Catherine's laugh as she scolded their son for tracking mud across her clean floor. The dog began barking, not the usual warning bark when a coyote wandered too close to the chicken coop, but something urgent, almost frantic. Buck's deep voice carried a note that made the hair on Jacob's neck stand up. Jacob closed the ledger and reached for the Winchester Model 1873 leaning against the doorframe. He lit a pitch torch from the cook stove and stepped into the autumn night, his breath clouding in the cold air. The frost had already settled across the yard, turning the packed dirt silver in the moonlight. Buck stood rigid near the storage barn, hackles raised, his body pointing like a compass needle toward the partially open door. Jacob raised the torch higher, and that was when he saw them. Footprints, small, narrow, uneven. They came from the direction of the creek, weaving an erratic path across his land, as if the person making them had stumbled repeatedly, catching themselves just before falling. But what made Jacob's chest tighten was the blood. Dark droplets, already oxidizing to rust in the cold night air, marked every 3rd or 4th step. He crouched down, bringing the torch closer to examine the tracks. The pattern was distinctive. Moccasins, not boots. The characteristic design of Comanche footwear, with the slight upturn at the toe, a woman's size based on the length and width, and beside those prints barely visible were smaller impressions. A child. Then Jacob saw it, caught on a thorn bush near the barn door, a strip of torn buckskin, deep red in color, still fresh enough that the fringe hadn't completely dried. Someone had torn through here in desperation, heedless of the thorns ripping at their clothing. He approached the barn door slowly, the Winchester held ready but not aimed at anything in particular. His 13 years in the Union Army, fighting from Shiloh to Appomattox, had taught him to read the difference between a threat approaching and someone fleeing in terror. These tracks spoke of the latter. The barn door stood ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. Jacob pushed it open with his boot, torch extended into the darkness. The light fell across bundles of hay, farm tools hanging on the wall, the iron plow he had been repairing, and there in the far corner, pressed against the rough wood planks, 2 figures huddled together in the shadows. A woman crouched low, her arms wrapped protectively around a small child. Even in the torchlight, Jacob could see the condition of her buckskin dress, torn at the shoulder, stained with dirt and what looked like older bloodstains. Her long black hair hung in 2 braids, one partially undone, tangled with bits of grass and small twigs. Her face bore the unmistakable features of the Comanche people. High cheekbones, dark eyes that reflected the firelight like those of a wild animal caught in a hunter's sight. But it was the child in her arms that made Jacob's breath catch. The little girl could not have been more than 4 years old. Her skin, naturally copper-toned, had taken on a grayish pallor beneath the dirt. Her breathing came in short, rapid gasps. Even from 10 feet away, Jacob could see the fever flush burning in her small face, could see how her lips had cracked and turned a concerning shade of purple-blue. He had seen that color before during the war, Sepsis, blood poisoning. Without treatment, the child had perhaps 24 hours, maybe less. The woman shifted, positioning her body as a shield between Jacob and the child. Her hand moved to her waist where a crude bone-handled knife hung from a leather cord. Her fingers trembled as they gripped it, not from fear alone, but from sheer physical exhaustion. This woman was running on nothing but desperate will. Jacob slowly lowered the Winchester, then crouched down, setting the torch in an iron bracket mounted on the barn wall. He needed both hands visible, needed to show he meant no immediate harm. The woman's lips moved, forming words in broken, heavily accented English. Please. Her voice came out as barely more than a whisper, raw and damaged from dryness. My daughter, she needs food. She paused, swallowing hard, and Jacob saw the terrible war playing out behind her eyes. Pride battling desperation. Survival instinct wrestling with something that looked like shame. Then, with visible effort, forcing each word past her lips as if speaking them caused physical pain, she said, I give myself, if you feed her. The words hung in the cold barn air like smoke from a gunshot. Jacob felt something cold and hard settle in his stomach. He understood exactly what she was offering, understood the depth of desperation required to make such an offer to a complete stranger. He had heard similar offers during the war, when Sherman's army had burned its way through Georgia and the Carolinas, leaving starvation in its wake. He had never accepted then. He would not accept now. No, Jacob said, keeping his voice low and steady, as he would when approaching a spooked horse. He saw her flinch at the word, saw her arms tighten around the child as if preparing for violence, for him to take what he wanted by force since she had been foolish enough to refuse him nothing. Jacob held up both hands, palms out. I don't trade in people. Your girl needs medicine. Both of you need food and water. That's what you'll get. Nothing else. Nothing more. No trade. No debt. Confusion flickered across her face like lightning in distant clouds. Her dark eyes searched his face, looking for the light, for the hidden price that would be extracted later. In her experience, men did not simply give. They took. But Jacob saw something else in her expression too. A desperate, fragile hope that she was trying very hard not to acknowledge, because hope betrayed would hurt worse than no hope at all. Can you walk to the house? Jacob asked. She nodded once, uncertain, still watching him as if he might transform into something predatory at any moment. Then come. Bring your daughter. Jacob stood slowly, picked up the torch and the Winchester, then turned his back on her and walked toward the cabin. It was a calculated risk, a gesture of trust. If she truly meant him harm, if desperation had driven her to violence, this would be her moment. But Jacob had learned long ago that trust sometimes required someone to take the first step alone, to show vulnerability first. Behind him, he heard the soft shuffle of moccasins on hay, then on dirt, then the heavier sound of feet on the wooden steps of his porch. She was following, carrying the child. He held the door open without looking directly at her, giving her the space and dignity to decide whether to enter. She stepped inside quickly, her eyes immediately scanning the room for exits, for weapons, for threats. She moved to put the table between herself and the door, still protecting her escape route while keeping Jacob in her line of sight. Her gaze swept across the sparse interior. The table and two chairs, the cook stove in the corner, the bed against the far wall, the mantel above the cold fireplace where the tintype photograph sat beside a worn Bible and a music box that no longer played. She took it all in with the quick assessment of someone who had learned to evaluate danger in seconds. Jacob set the Winchester on its pegs above the door, deliberately placing it within her sight, but not within easy reach for either of them. He moved to the cook stove and began building up the fire, adding kindling and small splits of pine until flames caught and began to spread. The woman watched every movement, her body coiled tight as a spring ready to release. From the shelf above the wash basin, Jacob retrieved a brown glass bottle with a handwritten label. Laudanum, tincture of opium mixed with alcohol. He had purchased it from the doctor in Fort Collins during Catherine's final days, when the coughing had become so violent that she could not sleep, could not rest, could only suffer. Most of the bottle remained unused. Catherine had refused it toward the end, wanting to remain clear-headed for whatever time she had left. Jacob measured out a careful dose into a tin cup, the amount appropriate for a small child, then added water from the pitcher to dilute it. For the fever, he said, setting it on the table within her reach, but not so close as to seem aggressive. Give her half now, half in 4 hours if the fever doesn't break. The woman stared at the cup as if it might contain poison. Jacob understood. Why should she trust anything he offered? He had given her no reason to believe his intentions were honest. Words were cheap, actions would have to speak. He walked to the cabinet and pulled out what food he had readily available. A loaf of bread he had baked just that morning, dense and hearty, a jar of honey he had traded for with a neighbor who kept bees, strips of dried venison from the deer he had shot 2 weeks prior. He set them all on the table, then deliberately stepped back to the stove, giving her space. Eat slowly, he said. Your stomach won't handle it well if you rush. She looked at the food, then at him, then down at her daughter whose small body had begun to shake with chills despite the high fever burning through her. The child's teeth chattered softly, a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet cabin. Decision made, the woman pulled out one of the chairs and sat down carefully, as if her legs might give out at any moment. She positioned the child on her lap and reached for the tin cup with trembling fingers. She brought it to the girl's cracked lips, supporting the small head with infinite gentleness. The child whimpered as she swallowed, a sound so small and hurt that it went through Jacob like a cavalry saber. He turned away, busying himself with heating water in the iron kettle, giving them what privacy he could in the small space. When he glanced back, the woman was tearing the bread into tiny pieces, feeding her daughter with the patience of someone who understood that small stomachs could not handle large portions after prolonged starvation. She had not taken any food for herself yet. Every piece, every drop of honey went to the child first. Jacob filled a bowl with warm water, found a clean cloth in the drawer where Catherine had kept the household linens, and set both on the table. For washing, he said simply. The woman looked up at him, and for the first time since he had found them in the barn, her expression held something other than raw fear. Confusion, deep suspicion, and beneath it all, barely visible, that dangerous flicker of hope. Why you help? She asked, her English halting but clear enough. White men, they take, not give. Jacob pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down slowly, keeping his posture open and unthreatening. He rested his hands on the table where she could see them. Your girl is sick. She needs help. That's reason enough. She studied his face as if trying to read a map written in a language she did not quite speak. Her eyes moved to the tintype photograph on the mantel, lingered there for a moment, then returned to his face. She saw something there that made her features soften almost imperceptibly. After a long moment, she lowered her gaze back to her daughter and continued feeding her. But Jacob noticed the way her shoulders had shifted, the defensive hunch easing slightly. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of something that might eventually become trust if he proved consistent. When the child had eaten and drunk as much as she could manage, her small stomach finally unable to accept more, the woman tore off a piece of bread for herself. She ate like someone who had forgotten what it felt like to have food, mechanically and without any sign of pleasure. Fuel for a body running on empty, nothing more. Jacob stood and moved to the bedroom, opening the chest at the foot of the bed. Inside lay the quilts Catherine had made during their first winter together, each one a testament to her determination to build a warm home in this harsh land. He brought out two of the heaviest and carried them to the main room. You and your daughter take the bed, he said, gesturing to the simple frame and corn husk mattress. I'll sleep by the stove. It's warmer there anyway. The woman's eyes widened. No, we sleep on floor. You give too much already. That bed hasn't been slept in for 3 years, Jacob said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. The words scraped against his throat. It should have someone in it who needs it. Her gaze went to the photograph again, then back to his face. Understanding dawned in her expression, followed by something that looked like compassion. She opened her mouth as if to speak words of sympathy or condolence, then closed it again. Some losses live too deep for words, especially words in a language not your own. She stood carefully, lifting her daughter with visible effort. The child's head lolled against her shoulder, the laudanum and food beginning to take effect. She carried the girl to the bed and laid her down with infinite gentleness, covering her small body with one of Catherine's quilts. The woman sat on the edge of the mattress, one hand resting on her daughter's chest, feeling the rise and fall to reassure herself that breath continued. Her own eyes were heavy, exhaustion pulling at her features, but she fought against sleep as if even now she did not dare fully surrender to rest. Jacob spread his own blanket near the cook stove and lay down on the hard wooden floor. He had slept in far worse places during the war. Muddy trenches, frozen fields. Once, memorably, in a hayloft while a battle raged in the farmyard below. Comfort was relative. He dimmed the oil lamp until only a faint glow remained, enough to see by if needed but not so bright as to prevent sleep. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Winter would come early this year. Jacob could feel it in his bones, in the old wound in his left shoulder that ached when the temperature dropped. "Thank you," the woman said into the semi-darkness, her voice so soft he almost missed it beneath the wind. "My name, Winter Moon, my daughter, Morning Star." Jacob turned his head to look at her. She sat silhouetted against the lamp glow, still upright, still watchful, one hand still resting on her child's chest. But her posture had changed, not quite relaxed, but no longer coiled for immediate flight. "Jacob Thornhill," he replied. "Rest now, you're safe here tonight." He heard her breathe in deeply, then exhale in a long, shuddering release. For the first time in what must have been many months, she allowed her guard to drop just enough to close her eyes. Jacob stared at the ceiling beams, his mind turning over the implications of what he had just done. Harboring a Comanche woman and child on his land could bring serious trouble. The Indian Appropriations Act of 1871 had made it clear that Native peoples were not permitted to live outside designated reservation boundaries without proper authorization. If discovered, Winter Moon would be forcibly removed to the Darlington Agency in Oklahoma Territory. The child would likely be separated from her mother and sent to one of the Indian boarding schools. But the law had also been clear about many things during the war, and Jacob had learned that legal and righteous were not always synonymous. Sometimes a man had to choose between the law and what was right, and live with the consequences of that choice. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, each note falling into the quiet cabin like stones into still water. Around 2 in the morning, Jacob heard the child begin to cough. Not the gentle clearing of a throat, but deep, racking spasms that shook her small frame. He heard Winter Moon murmur soft words in Comanche, heard the rustle of blankets as she gathered the girl close. Then Morning Star began to convulse. Jacob sat up immediately, recognizing the sound. Fever seizures. The child's temperature had spiked dangerously high. Winter Moon's voice rose in pitch, fear breaking through her careful control. She held her daughter as the small body jerked and twitched. Unable to do anything but keep the girl from injuring herself, Jacob moved quickly to the bedroom, to the trunk where he had kept Catherine's things untouched for 3 years. He opened it and pulled out one of her linen shifts, the fabric soaked and clean. Without hesitation, he tore it into strips. He grabbed the bowl of water, now cold, and brought it to the bedside. "Lay her flat," he said, "on her side so she doesn't choke." Winter Moon obeyed, her hands shaking as she positioned Morning Star. Jacob soaked the linen strips in the cold water and began placing them on the child's forehead, behind her neck, under her arms. The fever had turned her skin almost hot enough to burn. "This will help," Jacob said, continuing to work. "The cold will bring the fever down." Winter Moon watched him, her eyes wide and glistening with unshed tears. She reached out and gripped his forearm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. Not pulling him away, but anchoring herself to his certainty, his calm competence in this moment of terror. The seizure lasted perhaps 90 seconds, though it felt like hours. Gradually, the convulsions eased. Morning Star's body relaxed, her breathing settling into a more regular rhythm. The cold compresses began their work, pulling heat from her small body. Jacob kept changing the cloths, soaking them again in the cold water, replacing them methodically. Winter Moon helped, following his lead, their hands working in unconscious coordination. After perhaps 20 minutes, Morning Star's fever broke. Sweat beaded on her forehead as her body began to cool. Her breathing deepened, became more natural. She slipped into genuine sleep rather than fever-induced unconsciousness. Winter Moon released Jacob's arm and covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook, but she made no sound. These were tears she had probably been holding back for weeks, maybe months. Now, in this moment when her daughter had come so close to death and then stepped back, they finally broke through. Jacob stood and stepped back, giving her space for this private grief and relief. He returned the torn linen to the trunk, then moved back to his place by the stove. But before he lay down, he looked back at Wintermoon. She had lowered her hands and was looking at him with an expression he could not quite read. Not gratitude, though that was part of it. Not trust, though perhaps the seed of it had been planted. Something deeper. Recognition, perhaps. The acknowledgement that passed between two people who had both known loss, who had both fought desperately to save someone they loved, who understood the weight of helplessness and the fierce determination that came from refusing to accept it. "You could have let her die," Wintermoon said softly. "Would be easier for you. Oh, no trouble." "I didn't let my own family die easy," Jacob replied. "I'm not about to start with yours." She nodded slowly, then turned back to her daughter, her hand once again resting on the small chest to feel breath moving in and out. Jacob lay down and pulled the blanket over himself. He closed his eyes, but sleep did not come immediately. His mind played over the events of the night, the choice he had made, the road he had set his feet upon. The first gray light of dawn was just beginning to creep through the shutters when Jacob finally drifted into uneasy sleep. His last conscious thought was that the cabin, for the first time in 3 years, did not feel quite so much like a tomb. It felt like something that might, possibly, someday become a home again. He did not know that outside in the cold morning air, fresh hoof prints circled his property. 4 riders had come in the night, had seen the lamp burning, had seen shadows moving inside. They had left a message on his fence post. A strip of red buckskin cloth, torn from a dress, stabbed through with a railroad spike. A threat, a promise, a declaration that someone was looking for Wintermoon and they knew exactly where she was. The morning would bring new problems, but for now, for these few hours before dawn, 3 people slept under one roof. A man who had lost everything, a woman who had run out of places to run, a child who had been pulled back from the edge of death, and in the corner, the grandfather clock ticked steadily onward, marking time that would change all their lives forever. Dawn came slowly to the valley, pale light seeping through the gaps in the shutters like water through a cracked dam. Jacob woke to the smell of wood smoke and something else, something he had not smelled in his cabin for 3 years. Coffee. Real coffee, not the chicory substitute he had been drinking to stretch his supply through the winter. He sat up carefully, his back protesting from a night on the hard floor. Wintermoon stood at the cook stove, her movements cautious and deliberate as she worked the cast-iron kettle. She had found his coffee stores and was brewing a pot with the competence of someone who understood fire and heat, even if the equipment was unfamiliar. Morningstar remained asleep on the bed, her breathing steady and deep. The fever flush had faded from her cheeks, leaving her skin its natural color. The crisis had passed. Wintermoon turned at the sound of Jacob rising. "I hope is okay," she said, gesturing to the coffee. "I find in cabinet." "More than okay," Jacob replied, standing and stretching the stiffness from his shoulders. "Thank you." She poured coffee into 2 tin cups, her hands steadier than they had been the night before. Sleep and food had begun their restorative work. She handed him 1 cup, then wrapped both hands around her own, absorbing the warmth. They stood in silence for a moment, drinking coffee as the cabin slowly filled with morning light. It was a comfortable silence, the kind that exists between people who have shared something profound, even if they barely know each other's names. Jacob walked to the door and stepped outside, Morningstar still sleeping peacefully. The cold morning air bit at his face as he surveyed his land. Everything appeared normal. The chickens scratched in their pen. His horse, a sturdy bay gelding named Sherman, stood in the corral switching his tail. The barn door remained closed as he had left it. Then Jacob walked the fence line as he did most mornings, checking for damage from weather or animals. That was when he found it. Driven through the paw rail of his fence, a railroad spike had been hammered deep into the wood. Impaled on the spike was a strip of red buckskin cloth, torn and frayed at the edges. The same color as Wintermoon's dress. The same material. Someone had left this here deliberately, a message written in cloth and iron. Jacob pulled the spike free and examined the fabric. Fresh, This had been placed sometime during the night while he slept with two strangers under his roof. Someone had been watching. Someone knew Wintermoon was here. He scanned the ground around the fence post. Hoof prints, several sets, all fresh. The tracks showed that at least 4 horses had circled his property, their riders keeping to the shadows, observing but not approaching. Not yet. Jacob folded the cloth and pocketed it, then returned to the cabin. Wintermoon looked up as he entered, and something in his expression made her set down her coffee cup. "What wrong?" she asked. Jacob showed her the red cloth. Her face went pale, her hand moving instinctively to the torn shoulder of her dress where the fabric had been ripped away. "They find me," she whispered. "They know I hear." "Who are they?" Wintermoon sat down heavily in the chair, her brief moment of peace shattered. "Buffalo hunters. 3 men. Their leader named Ezra Blackwood." She spoke slowly, choosing her English words with care. "My husband, Swift Eagle, he was good hunter. Provide for family. Last summer, Blackwood men come to our camp. Say Swift Eagle owe money from bet. Bet on who kill most buffalo." Her voice dropped, became harder. "Swift Eagle never make bet, never gamble. But Blackwood say he owe $50. When Swift Eagle say no, Blackwood shoot him. In front of me, in front of Morning Star." Jacob felt his jaw tighten. "And the law did nothing?" Wintermoon's laugh was bitter. "Law for white men, not for Comanche. I run, take Morning Star. They chase. Say I must pay husband debt. Say I belong to Blackwood now, like horse or rifle." She looked down at her hands. "I run for 14 months. Hide. They find me twice. I escape. Third time, I have no strength left. I find your barn." Jacob walked to the window and looked out at his land, at the fence post where the warning had been left. The pieces fell into place. Ezra Blackwood and his men were hunting Wintermoon not for justice, but for possession. In their twisted logic, she was property to be claimed, a debt to be collected. "How many men does Blackwood have?" Jacob asked. 3, maybe 4. All hunters, all mean. Jacob nodded slowly. He walked to the cabinet above the wash basin and pulled out a wooden box. Inside were papers. His homestead claim, filed in 1875. The deed to his land, earned after 5 years of continuous improvement. His discharge papers from the Union Army. And beneath those, blank sheets of certificate paper he had purchased for official correspondence, along with a wax seal and a bottle of ink. He spread one of the blank certificates on the table and sat down. Wintermoon watched him, confusion evident on her face. "The law says you cannot be here," Jacob explained, pulling the ink bottle closer. "The Indian Appropriations Act forbids Comanche from living outside reservations without authorization. If the authorities find you here, they will take you to Darlington Agency in Oklahoma. They will take Morning Star from you and send her to a boarding school, probably Carlisle in Pennsylvania. You will not see your daughter again." Wintermoon's breath caught. "Then I must go. I bring danger to you." "No," Jacob said firmly. "There is another way. Not legal exactly, but legal enough to provide protection." He dipped his pen in the ink and began to write in his careful, practiced script. "I'm going to create an indenture contract, a work agreement. It will state that you are employed by me as a household servant for a term of 5 years, from 1878 to 1883. In exchange for your labor, you receive wages of $2 per month, plus room and board." "I not understand," Wintermoon said. "This make me slave?" "No," Jacob replied, continuing to write. "Indentured servitude is different from slavery. It is a legal contract with a fixed term. After 5 years, you are free with no obligations. But while the contract is active, you have legal protection as an employee on my homestead. The Homestead Act gives me the right to hire labor as needed to work my land. This contract makes you legal." He filled in the details methodically. Duration of service, duties expected, compensation provided, terms of termination. When he finished, he signed his name at the bottom with a flourish, then heated wax and pressed his personal seal into it, the one his father had given him when he left for the war. "This is not perfect," Jacob admitted. "A lawyer might find holes in it, a judge might question it, but it gives us a foundation to stand on. It makes you less vulnerable." Winter Moon looked at the document, at the words she could not read. Why you do this? You not know me. I bring trouble. Jacob met her eyes. 3 years ago, my wife and son died in this house. I could not save them. I begged God for the power to save them, but God was not listening. Or perhaps God had other plans. When I found you and Morningstar in my barn, I saw a chance to do what I could not do before. To protect someone. To save a life that mattered. He paused, then continued more quietly. You do not bring trouble, Winter Moon. Trouble found you through no fault of your own. That is different. Tears welled in Winter Moon's eyes, but she blinked them back. I not know how to thank you. No thanks needed, just rest, heal, let your daughter recover. Jacob stood and placed the contract in his document box. When you are strong enough, I will begin teaching you to read and write English. If anyone questions you, you need to be able to explain this contract in your own words. A soft sound came from the bed. Morningstar was waking, her small hand rubbing at her eyes. Winter Moon went to her immediately, gathering the child into her arms and murmuring soft words in Comanche. Jacob busied himself at the stove, giving them privacy for their reunion. He prepared a simple breakfast of cornmeal mush with honey, enough for 3 people. As he worked, he found himself thinking about the hoof prints circling his property, about Ezra Blackwood and his men watching from the shadows. They would come. Perhaps not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but they would come. Men like Blackwood did not give up easily, especially when they believed something belonged to them. The question was not if they would confront him, but when and how he would handle it when they did. After breakfast, Jacob taught Winter Moon how to operate the cast iron cook stove, showing her the damper that controlled airflow and temperature. This lever here, he explained, demonstrating, opens and closes the flue. More air means hotter fire. Less air means the fire burns slower, lasts longer. She watched intently, asking questions in her halting English, her fingers tracing the mechanisms as he explained them. She was intelligent, Jacob realized, quick to understand. Given time and proper instruction, she would manage the household with competence. Morningstar sat at the table, playing with a small hammer from Jacob's toolbox. The child's recovery continued to progress. Color had returned fully to her cheeks. Her eyes, though still tired, held a spark of curiosity as she examined the tool, turning it over in her small hands. Papa make her toy horse, Winter Moon said, watching her daughter. From iron. Swift Eagle was good with fire and metal. She paused. Morningstar loved that horse. I lose it when we run from Blackwood men. Jacob glanced at the child, at the way she held the hammer with such focus. An idea formed. I have a forge, he said, behind the barn. If you would permit it, I could make her a new horse. Not to replace the one her father made, but to keep her company while she heals. Winter Moon's expression softened. You have big heart, Jacob Thornhill. You do too much for us. It is just a piece of iron, Jacob replied. I have plenty of scrap metal. It would take me perhaps an hour. That afternoon, while Winter Moon cleaned and organized the cabin, Jacob went to his forge. The small building housed his anvil, his collection of hammers and tongs, and the coal-fired furnace where he shaped iron into useful objects. He had learned blacksmithing from his father, had continued practicing during the war when the army needed horseshoes and wagon repairs. He selected a piece of scrap iron, heated it in the forge until it glowed orange, then began to work. The hammer rang against the anvil in the steady rhythm he had learned decades ago. Shape the body, form the legs, curve the neck, add details to suggest a mane and tail. It was simple work, the kind that allowed his mind to wander while his hands followed familiar patterns. As he worked, Jacob thought about Winter Moon's story, about Swift Eagle dying for a debt he never owed, about a woman and child forced to run for 14 months with no safe harbor. He thought about the cruelty of men like Blackwood, who saw other human beings as property to be claimed. He thought about his own choices, about the path he had committed to by sheltering them. When he finished, he had created a small iron horse, 4 inches long, with a flowing mane and raised front legs as if rearing up in spirit. He quenched it in water, filed the rough edges smooth, then carried it back to the cabin. Morningstar's face transformed when she saw it. She reached for the toy with both hands, a smile breaking across her features like sunlight through storm clouds. She held it close to her chest, then made it gallop across the table surface, creating small hoofbeat sounds with her mouth. Wintermoon looked at Jacob with an expression that held more than gratitude, something deeper, recognition of kindness given freely, without expectation of return. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried weight. That evening, as the sun set behind the western ridge, Jacob sat at the table with Wintermoon and began the first reading lesson. He opened Catherine's Bible to the book of Genesis and pointed to the first word. "In," he said. "This word is in." Wintermoon repeated the word, her pronunciation careful. "In." "The," Jacob continued, moving his finger. "This is the." They worked through the first verse slowly, Jacob pronouncing each word, Wintermoon repeating. Morningstar sat on her mother's lap, watching the page intently, even though the letters meant nothing to her yet. Outside, darkness gathered. Jacob lit the oil lamp, and the lesson continued in its warm glow. When Wintermoon's eyes grew too tired to focus, Jacob closed the Bible. "We will continue tomorrow," he said. "Learning takes time." As he prepared to settle by the stove for another night on the floor, Wintermoon stopped him. "Jacob," she said softly, "you sleep in bed. I sleep by fire. Is right. This your house?" "No," Jacob replied. "You and Morningstar need the bed more than I do. My back is accustomed to hard ground. Yours needs rest to heal." They looked at each other across the small cabin, neither willing to take comfort at the other's expense. Finally, Wintermoon smiled slightly, the first genuine smile Jacob had seen from her. "We both too stubborn," she said. "Perhaps," Jacob agreed, "but I have practice being stubborn. 3 years' worth. You sleep in the bed." She nodded, accepting his decision, and carried Morningstar to the bed. As she tucked the child under the quilts, she said quietly, "When I am stronger, I help you. With work. With land. I know plants, herbs. I can make medicine. I can tan leather, sew, cook. I'm not useless." "I never thought you were," Jacob replied. He dimmed the lamp and lay down by the stove, listening to the wind outside and the soft breathing of the woman and child who had entered his life barely 24 hours ago. So much had changed, so much remained uncertain. But as he closed his eyes, Jacob realized something. For the first time in 3 years, he had a reason to wake up that extended beyond simple survival. He had people depending on him. He had purpose again. Outside in the darkness, the hoof prints around his fence remained fresh. Ezra Blackwood and his men were still out there, waiting, watching, planning their next move. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. But tonight, 3 people rested under one roof, a temporary island of safety in a world that offered precious little of it. Jacob pulled the blanket closer and let sleep take him, knowing that soon enough he would have to face the storm gathering on his horizon. 5 days passed in deceptive peace. Morningstar grew stronger each day, her laughter returning like birdsong after a storm. Wintermoon learned to read simple words, her finger tracing beneath sentences in Catherine's Bible with growing confidence. Jacob worked his land as autumn deepened, preparing for winter while keeping one eye always on the horizon. But peace built on borrowed time carries its own weight, and on the 6th morning, that weight came crashing down. Jacob was mending fence on the eastern boundary when he heard Sherman whinny an alarm from the corral. He straightened, his hand moving instinctively to the Colt Peacemaker holstered at his hip. In the distance, 4 riders crested the ridge, silhouetted against the morning sun. They came at an easy pace, unhurried, confident. The lead rider was a big man, broad-shouldered and thick through the chest, sitting his horse like someone who had spent more years in the saddle than on foot. Even from 200 yards away, Jacob could see the rifle scabbard on his saddle and the way the other 3 riders spread out slightly, flanking their leader. Jacob walked back toward the cabin, keeping his movement steady and deliberate. He did not run. Running would show fear, and fear invited aggression. He had learned that lesson during the war. Wintermoon stood in the doorway, Morningstar held tight against her hip. She had seen the riders too. Her face had gone pale, her body rigid with the instinct to flee. But there was nowhere to run now. Not with a child, not with men on horseback. "Go inside," Jacob said quietly as he reached the porch. "Take Morningstar into the bedroom. Close the door. Do not come out until I tell you." "Jacob, they will kill you," Wintermoon whispered, her voice shaking. They will try to intimidate me, Jacob corrected. That is different from killing. Now go, quickly. She hesitated for one more heartbeat, then disappeared inside. Jacob heard the bedroom door close. He picked up the Winchester from where it leaned against the porch rail and stood waiting, the rifle held loosely in both hands. Not aimed, not threatening, but present. The riders approached at a walk, their horses' hooves crunching on the frost-hardened ground. They stopped 30 feet from the cabin, close enough to talk without shouting, far enough to avoid immediate danger. The lead rider pushed back his wide-brimmed hat, revealing a weathered face marked by years of sun and wind. His eyes were pale blue, almost colorless, with the flat affect of someone who had looked at death so often it no longer moved him. "You must be Thornhill," the man said. His voice carried the rough edges of someone who spent more time with animals than people. "I am Ezra Blackwood. These are my associates." He did not introduce the other three men. They sat their horses in silence, watching Jacob with the patient stillness of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go. "This is my land," Jacob replied evenly. "State your business or ride on." Blackwood smiled, showing teeth stained yellow from tobacco. "My business is simple. You have something that belongs to me, a Comanche woman named of Winter Moon and her whelp. I have come to collect what is mine." "No person belongs to another," Jacob said. "Slavery ended 13 years ago." "I am not talking about slavery," Blackwood replied. "I am talking about debt. Her man, Swift Eagle, owed me $50 from a wager on a buffalo hunt. He died before he could pay. Under frontier law, his debt's transferred to his widow. She owes me $50 or she works off the debt in service." "Frontier law," Jacob repeated. "You mean no law at all. You mean the law of men with guns who take what they want and call it justice." Blackwood's smile widened. "Call it what you like. The woman is mine by right of debt. Send her out and we will leave peaceful. Keep her and we will take her. Either way, I leave here with what belongs to me." "She does not belong to you," Jacob said. "She is employed by me under legal contract, indentured servitude, properly documented and sealed. She works my land for 5 years, then she is free. That is the law, Blackwood. Real law, not the kind you make up as you go." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Blackwood's face. "You are lying. No white man would contract with a squaw." "Come see the papers if you doubt me," Jacob replied. "They are filed and recorded, all proper and legal." One of the other riders, a lean man with a scar running from his left eye to his jaw, spat on the ground. "He is bluffing, Ezra. No papers exist." But Blackwood held up a hand, silencing him. The buffalo hunter was many things, but he was not stupid. He understood that if Jacob truly had legal documentation, taking Winter Moon by force would put Blackwood on the wrong side of territorial law. Buffalo hunters operated in a gray area, but kidnapping a contracted worker from a legitimate homesteader would bring real consequences. "Show me these papers," Blackwood demanded. "No," Jacob said flatly. "You are not welcome in my home. If you want to see the contract, you can view it at the land office in Fort Collins when I file it next week. Until then, get off my property." Blackwood's jaw tightened. For a long moment, the only sound was the wind moving through the dry grass and the creak of saddle leather as the horses shifted their weight. Jacob kept his finger near the trigger guard of the Winchester, ready but not threatening. 4 against 1 were poor odds, but he had the advantage of position and preparation. They would have to cross open ground to reach him, and he could drop at least 2 before they closed the distance. "This is not finished, Thornhill," Blackwood said finally. "I will see those papers, and if they are not real, if you are lying to me, I will come back and burn this place to the ground with you inside it." "If you come back to my property without invitation," Jacob replied, "I will shoot you for trespassing." "That is also legal, Blackwood. Very legal." The buffalo hunter stared at him for another moment, then wheeled his horse around. The other 3 followed. They rode back the way they had come, but slowly, taking their time, making it clear that they left by choice rather than fear. Jacob watched until they disappeared over the ridge. Only then did he lower the Winchester and release the breath he had been holding. His hands were steady, but he could feel the adrenaline singing through his blood, the old familiar feeling from the war when death had come close and then passed by. The bedroom door opened. Winter Moon emerged, her face drawn with fear. "They will come back," she said. "Blackwood does not give up, never." "I know," Jacob replied, "which is why we need to make those papers real. I told him the contract would be filed in Fort Collins. That gives us 7 days to make it legitimate before he can check." "How we do that?" Winter Moon asked. Jacob set the Winchester down and walked to the cabinet where he kept his documents. "We need someone with legal authority to witness and notarize the contract. Someone whose signature carries weight, and we need to file it officially at the land office before Blackwood can challenge it." He thought for a moment, then nodded to himself. "Reverend Nathan Pierce visits the homesteads once a month to conduct services and check on families. He is due to arrive here tomorrow or the day after. He is a man of Bama, but he also serves as a notary public for the territory. If I can convince him to witness the contract, it becomes legally binding." "Will he do this?" Winter Moon asked. "Help Indian woman?" "Pierce is a good man," Jacob said. "He believes in the law, but he also believes in mercy. I think he will help us, especially if he understands that refusing means sending you back to men like Blackwood." That afternoon, Jacob rode Sherman to the neighboring homestead 3 miles south, where Thomas and Martha Hensley worked a smaller claim with their 2 teenage sons. Martha Hensley was known throughout the valley for her kindness and her unwillingness to abide cruelty in any form. Jacob found Thomas repairing his barn roof, his sons handing up shingles from below. "Thomas," Jacob called up, "I need to ask you something." Thomas climbed down the ladder, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cold. "What can I do for you, Jacob?" "Have you seen Reverend Pierce recently? I need to speak with him on a matter of some urgency." Thomas nodded. "He was here yesterday, said he would be working his way north through the valley. Should reach your place tomorrow, I reckon." "Thank you," Jacob said, preparing to mount Sherman again. "Jacob," Thomas said, his voice dropping, "I heard talk in town last week. Silas Crawford from the land office has been asking questions about you, wanting to know about improvements on your claim, whether you are keeping up with the requirements of the Homestead Act." Jacob felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Silas Crawford was the territorial land commissioner, a man known for his rigid interpretation of land law and his willingness to seize properties that failed to meet every letter of the homestead requirements. "What kind of questions?" "Whether you are working the full 640 acres, whether you have made the required improvements, whether anyone else is living on your claim who might compromise your standing." Thomas met Jacob's eyes. "I told him you run the most productive homestead in the valley, and any fool can see you have met every requirement twice over. But Crawford has a reputation for finding reasons to seize land when it suits his purposes." "Why would it suit his purposes to seize my land?" Jacob asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Your property sits on one of the best water sources in the territory," Thomas replied. "The creek that runs through your land feeds half the valley. Control that water, and you control who prospers and who fails. Crawford has been buying up failed homesteads for years, assembling a ranch bigger than any single man should own. Your land would be the crown jewel of that collection." Jacob absorbed this information in silence, so he faced threats from 2 directions now. Blackwood wanted Wintermoon. Crawford wanted his land, and both men were willing to use whatever leverage they could find to take what they wanted. "Thank you for the warning, Thomas," Jacob said. "Watch yourself, Jacob," Thomas replied. "Crawford is a dangerous man. He hides behind the law, but he is no more honest than the outlaws who hide from it." Jacob rode back to his cabin as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. Wintermoon had prepared an evening meal, simple but nourishing, and they ate together as twilight filled the valley. Morning Star sat on Jacob's knee, playing with her iron horse and telling him elaborate stories in a mixture of English and Comanche that he could only partly understand, but found himself smiling at nonetheless. After the child had been put to bed, Jacob sat with Wintermoon at the table and explained about Crawford, about the questions being asked, about the additional danger they now faced. "I bring you nothing but trouble," Wintermoon said quietly. "Maybe I should go. Take Morning Star. Disappear before I cost you everything." "No," Jacob said firmly. "Running will not solve anything. Blackwood will hunt you until he finds you, and without the protection of this contract, you will have no defense. And Crawford will find some other excuse to challenge my claim if he wants it badly enough." He reached across the table and took her hand, a gesture that surprised them both with its intimacy. We face this together. We make the contract legitimate. We stand on the law, even when the law is being twisted against us. That is how we win. Wintermoon looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. Why you fight for me? You risk everything. Your land, maybe your life. Jacob thought about Catherine and Samuel, about the 3 years he had spent existing rather than living, about the emptiness that had filled his days until a desperate woman and a sick child had stumbled into his barn seeking help. Because 3 years ago, I lost everything that mattered to me, he said. I thought I would never care about anything again. But you and Morningstar reminded me that there are things worth fighting for, people worth protecting. And if I have to risk my land or my life to do what is right, then that is a risk I choose to take. Wintermoon's eyes glistened with unshed tears. She squeezed his hand, her fingers small and warm in his calloused palm. I will learn to read, she said. I will learn your language, your laws. I will become strong enough to stand beside you, not just behind you. You are already strong, Jacob replied. You survived 14 months of running. You kept your daughter Imam when most would have given up. That strength is why I believe we can win this fight. They sat in silence for a while, hands still joined, the oil lamp burning low between them. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring Reverend Pierce, and with him the chance to make their defense legitimate. But tonight, for this moment, they were simply two people who had found unexpected alliance in a harsh world. Wintermoon stood to bank the fire for the night, and Jacob prepared his blanket by the stove. The routine had become familiar now, almost comfortable. But as Jacob lay down to sleep, he could not shake the image of Ezra Blackwood's cold eyes, or the warning about Silas Crawford circling like a vulture waiting for weakness. The storm was building. The only question was how fierce it would be when it finally broke. In the bedroom, he heard Wintermoon singing softly to Morningstar in Comanche, an old lullaby that spoke of safe journeys and homecoming. The song wrapped around him in the darkness, and Jacob closed his eyes, letting it carry him towards sleep. Tomorrow would bring the Reverend, and after that, one way or another, their path would become clear. Reverend Nathan Pierce arrived just after noon the following day, his wagon creaking to a halt in front of Jacob's cabin. He was a man in his middle 40s, lean and weathered from years of traveling between scattered homesteads, bringing scripture and comfort to families who lived too far from proper churches. His black coat had been mended many times, and his Bible showed the wear of constant use, but his eyes held the clarity of someone whose faith had been tested and had held firm. Jacob met him on the porch, extending his hand in greeting. Reverend Us Pierce, thank you for stopping. Jacob, Pierce replied, shaking his hand firmly. I always stop here, though I confess your attendance at services has been sparse these past years. He said it without judgment, simply stating fact. I have had little to say to God since Catherine and Samuel died, Jacob admitted. Seemed hypocritical to sit in prayer when I blamed him for taking them. Pierce nodded slowly. Grief makes honest men of us all. Some turn to God in sorrow, others turn away. Neither response surprises him, I suspect. He glanced past Jacob toward the cabin door. But I sense you did not ask me here to discuss theology. No, Jacob agreed. I need your help with a legal matter, and I need to ask you to keep an open mind about what I am going to show you. Pierce's expression shifted to one of caution, but he followed Jacob into the cabin. Wintermoon stood near the cook stove, her posture defensive, ready to flee if necessary. Morningstar sat at the table, carefully tracing letters on a slate board with a piece of chalk, her tongue poking out slightly in concentration. The Reverend stopped in the doorway, taking in the scene. His eyes moved from Wintermoon to the child, then to the bed where Catherine's quilts lay neatly folded, then back to Jacob. Understanding dawned across his features, followed by concern. Jacob, Pierce said carefully, do you understand the legal position you have placed yourself in? I do, Jacob replied, which is why I need your help. He walked to the cabinet and retrieved the indenture contract. I need you to witness and notarize this document. It establishes Wintermoon as a legally contracted worker on my homestead for a term of 5 years. Pierce took the paper and read it carefully, his lips moving slightly as he absorbed each clause. When he finished, he looked up at Jacob with an expression that mixed sympathy with worry. This is well written, surprisingly so. But Jacob, you know the Indian Appropriations Act forbids members of reservation tribes from living outside designated boundaries without proper authorization from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. A private employment contract does not supersede federal law. The Homestead Act grants me the right to hire labor necessary to work my claim, Jacob countered. That is also federal law. And the act makes no restrictions based on the race or origin of the workers I employ. That interpretation would require a judge to rule in your favor, Pierce said, and most territorial judges would not be sympathetic to this arrangement, regardless of the legal merit. I understand the risk, Jacob said, but without this contract, Winter Moon has no protection at all. Men are already hunting her, claiming she owes them money and belongs to them by right of debt. At least with legal papers, she has something to stand behind, something more than just my word and my rifle. Pierce set the contract down on the table and walked to the window, staring out at the valley for a long moment. Jacob waited, knowing that the Reverend was a man who weighed his choices carefully, who understood that every decision carried consequences that rippled outward. Tell me the full story, Pierce said finally, not turning around. Leave nothing out. Jacob told him everything. Winter Moon's flight from Ezra Blackwood and his men, Swift Eagle's murder over a fabricated debt, the 14 months of running and hiding, Morning Star's near death from fever and infection, Blackwood's visit 5 days ago with his threats and demands, the warning about Silas Crawford circling like a predator seeking weakness. When Jacob finished, Pierce remained silent for another long moment. Then he turned back to face them. Winter Moon, yeah, he said gently. May I speak with you directly? She nodded, her hands clasped tightly together. Did your husband owe Ezra Blackwood money? Pierce asked. No, Winter Moon replied, her English slow but clear. Swift Eagle never gamble, never make bet. Blackwood lie. Blackwood want our hunting ground, want our water. When Swift Eagle say no, Blackwood shoot him. I see it happen. And you have been running ever since? Yes, Blackwood say I belong to him now, say I must work for him until debt paid. But there is no debt, only lie. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, anger pushing past fear. I not animal, I not property, I am person. My daughter is person. We deserve to live free. Pierce studied her face, seeing the truth written plainly there. He turned to Jacob. And you are willing to risk your homestead, your standing in the community, possibly your life, to protect them? I am, Jacob said simply. The Reverend picked up the contract again, reading it one more time with even greater care. This document is not perfect, he said finally. A lawyer could find arguments against it. The territorial government could challenge it, but it is legitimate in its construction and its intent. And I believe in the eyes of God, if not always in the eyes of men, protecting the innocent from those who would enslave them is righteous work. He pulled a pen from his coat pocket and dipped it in Jacob's ink bottle. With steady strokes, he signed his name as witness and pressed his notary seal into the wax. This contract is now legally binding, recognized by the territory of Colorado and the United States government. May God grant that it provides the protection you seek. Winter Moon's breath escaped in a sob of relief. She covered her mouth with both hands, fighting to maintain composure. Morning Star looked up from her slate board, sensing her mother's emotion, and ran to wrap small arms around Winter Moon's waist. Thank you, Jacob said, feeling weight lift from his shoulders even as he understood that this was only the first step in a much longer battle. Pierce handed the contract back to Jacob. You need to file this at the land office in Fort Collins as soon as possible. The sooner it becomes part of the official record, the harder it will be for anyone to challenge. I will ride there tomorrow, Jacob said. No, Pierce said firmly. You will ride there today, right now. Silas Crawford has connections throughout the territory, and if he learns of this contract before it is filed, he will find ways to delay or block its acceptance. He glanced at Winter Moon and Morning Star. I will stay here until you return. I can offer some protection by my presence, and it would be improper for a woman to remain alone on a homestead with only a child for company. Jacob understood the offer for what it was. Pierce's presence would provide not just physical protection, but moral authority. Anyone who came to the cabin while Jacob was gone would have to deal with a man of the church, and even hardened men like Blackwood often hesitated to commit violence in front of a reverend. "I will leave immediately," Jacob said. He turned to Wintermoon. "I should return by nightfall if I push hard. Keep the rifle loaded and near the door. If anyone comes who makes you afraid, go to Reverend Pierce." Wintermoon nodded, her eyes showing worry, but also determination. "We will be safe. You be careful on road." Jacob gathered the contract and his personal documents, saddled Sherman, and rode hard for Fort Collins. The town sat 25 miles to the east, and the road was rough but passable. He made good time, pushing the horse faster than he normally would, knowing that every minute mattered. Fort Collins was a growing settlement, its main street lined with false-fronted buildings that housed dry goods stores, a bank, a hotel, 2 saloons, and the territorial land office. Jacob tied Sherman outside the land office and walked inside, his boots loud on the wooden floor. A clerk sat behind a desk, a thin man with spectacles and ink-stained fingers. He looked up as Jacob approached. "Can I help you?" "I need to file an employment contract," Jacob said, placing the document on the desk. "Indenture servitude agreement, properly notarized." The clerk picked up the contract and began to read. His eyebrows rose as he absorbed the contents. "This is highly unusual," he said. "An indenture contract with a native woman?" "Is it illegal?" Jacob asked. "No," the clerk admitted, "but Commissioner Crawford generally reviews all contracts involving native peoples before they are officially filed." "Silas Crawford is not the law," Jacob said, keeping his voice level. "He is an administrator. Filing this contract is a matter of public record, not subject to his personal approval. I have the notarized signature of Reverend Nathan Pierce, a recognized notary public of this territory. The contract is legal and binding. Now file it." The clerk hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with going around Crawford's authority. Jacob leaned forward, his hands flat on the desk. "I served 3 years in the Union Army. I fought at Shiloh and Chickamauga. I have kept my homestead claim in perfect standing for 8 years. I pay my taxes. I obey the law. Now you are going to file this legal document, or I am going to ask you to explain to a federal judge why you refuse to process legitimate paperwork from a citizen in good standing." The clerk swallowed hard, then nodded. "Yes, sir, I will file it immediately." He pulled out a large ledger book and began copying the contract's details into the official record. When he finished, he stamped both the original contract and a copy with the territorial seal. "Filed and recorded. You are entitled to keep the original. A copy will remain in our permanent files." "Thank you," Jacob said, taking the stamped contract. He walked out into the afternoon sun, feeling the first real sense of security since this had all begun. The contract was official now, legally recognized. Whatever challenges lay ahead, at least Wintermoon had legitimate standing. He was untying Sherman when a voice called out behind him. "Thornhill." Jacob turned to see Silas Crawford standing on the boardwalk outside his office. The land commissioner was a well-dressed man in his early 50s, his suit expensive, and his boots polished to a mirror shine. Everything about him spoke of wealth and authority, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "Commissioner Crawford," Jacob said neutrally. "I understand you just filed an unusual contract," Crawford said, walking closer. "Indenture agreement with a Comanche woman, I am told." Word traveled fast. Too fast. The clerk must have sent someone to inform Crawford the moment Jacob left. "The contract is legal and properly executed," Jacob replied, "as I am sure you will discover when you review the files." "Legal, perhaps," Crawford said, "but ill-advised. You are harboring a member of a reservation tribe on your property. That opens you to scrutiny under multiple federal statutes. It would be unfortunate if such scrutiny revealed other irregularities with your homestead claim." When the threat was clear, Crawford would use any excuse to challenge Jacob's standing, to find technical violations that could justify seizing the land. "My claim is in perfect order," Jacob said. "Every acre worked, every improvement documented, every requirement exceeded. You will find no irregularities because none exist." Crawford smiled, but the expression held no warmth. "We shall see. The law has many clauses, Thornhill. Many requirements that honest men sometimes overlook in their rush to establish their holdings. I would hate for an oversight to cost you everything you have built. Is that a threat, Commissioner? It is a warning, Crawford replied, from one man who understands the law to another who perhaps does not understand it quite as well as he believes. He tipped his hat in mock courtesy. Good day, Thornhill. I am certain we will speak again soon. Jacob watched him walk back into the land office, every instinct screaming that he had just made a powerful enemy. But there had been no other choice. Protecting Wintermoon and Morningstar required legal standing, and that meant accepting whatever consequences Crawford chose to inflict. He mounted Sherman and turned toward home, riding hard through the gathering dusk. The sun was setting behind the mountains when he finally saw his cabin in the distance, smoke rising from the chimney, lamplight glowing in the windows, a peaceful scene that belied the storm building around it. Reverend Pierce met him at the door. Any trouble? The contract is filed, Jacob said, dismounting. But Silas Crawford knows about it. He made his displeasure clear. Pierce nodded grimly. Crawford is a dangerous man. He has ruined more than one homesteader by finding obscure violations of land law. You will need to be very careful going forward. Wintermoon appeared in the doorway, Morningstar on her hip. You come back, she said, relief evident in her voice. I worry. I gave my word I would return, Jacob said. He held up the stamped contract. This is official now. Filed and recorded. You have legal protection. She took the document with trembling hands, staring at it as if it were made of gold rather than paper. This means we can stay? It means we have a foundation to fight from, Jacob replied. It does not guarantee victory, but it gives us a chance. Pierce stayed for supper, then prepared to continue his circuit to the next homestead. Before he left, he pulled Jacob aside. I will do what I can to spread word of your contract among the other families in the valley. Public knowledge is a form of protection. The more people who know about this arrangement, the harder it will be for Crawford or Blackwood to act against you in secret. Thank you, Reverend, Jacob said, for everything. I did only what my conscience demanded, Pierce replied, which is all any of us can do. He glanced back at the cabin where Wintermoon was putting Morningstar to bed. You are doing a good thing here, Jacob, a righteous thing. But righteous men often pay a high price for their convictions. Be prepared for that. After Pierce departed, Jacob sat with Wintermoon at the table. They did not speak much, but the silence held a new quality. Partnership, mutual respect, the beginning of something that went deeper than simple alliance. Tomorrow I teach you more reading, Jacob said, and I teach you to shoot the Winchester properly. If trouble comes, you need to be able to defend yourself and Morningstar. You think Blackwood will come back? Wintermoon asked. I know he will, Jacob replied. The contract protects you legally, but men like Blackwood do not always respect legal boundaries. We need to be ready for whatever he brings. Wintermoon met his eyes, her jaw set with determination. Then we be ready together. Jacob nodded, feeling a surge of respect for this woman who had survived so much and refused to break. Together, he agreed. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, marking the end of another day and the beginning of whatever trials tomorrow would bring. Jacob banked the fire and lay down by the stove, listening to the wind outside and the steady breathing of the woman and child who had become more than refugees seeking shelter. They had become his responsibility, his purpose, and perhaps, though he barely dared to acknowledge it, the beginning of a new family built not from blood, but from choice, from shared struggle, from two damaged people finding unexpected strength in each other. Outside, the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. Inside, three people slept under one roof, protected for now by nothing more than paper and ink and the determination of one man who had finally found something worth fighting for again. The storm was coming, but they would face it together. 3 weeks passed. The contract remained filed and unchallenged. Ezra Blackwood had not returned. Silas Crawford made no move against Jacob's homestead. It was the kind of quiet that felt less like peace and more like the silence before thunder. Jacob used the time well. He taught Wintermoon to handle the Winchester, showing her how to load, aim, and fire with accuracy. She proved a quick student, her hands steady once she overcame her initial hesitation. Morningstar grew stronger each day, her laughter filling the cabin with a sound Jacob had thought he would never hear again in his home. In the evenings, Winter Moon's reading lessons continued. She could now work through simple passages in the Bible, her finger tracing beneath words with growing confidence. Sometimes Jacob would look up from his own work to find her studying him, her expression thoughtful and unguarded. In those moments, something passed between them that had nothing to do with contracts or protection, something neither was quite ready to name. The first snow came early, dusting the valley in white. Jacob was in the barn repairing harness leather when he heard Sherman whinny sharply. He set down his tools and walked to the barn door, his hand automatically checking the colt at his hip. A single rider approached from the south, moving slowly through the falling snow. As the figure drew closer, Jacob recognized Thomas Hensley from the neighboring homestead. Thomas looked grim, his face tight with worry. "Jacob," Thomas called as he reined in his horse. "We need to talk, inside if you do not mind. This concerns everyone." Jacob led him into the cabin where Winter Moon was teaching Morningstar to shape bread dough. She looked up at Thomas's entrance, her body tensing automatically. "Thomas Hensley," Jacob said, making introductions. "My neighbor to the south. Thomas, this is Winter Moon and her daughter Morningstar." Thomas removed his hat and nodded respectfully to Winter Moon. "Ma'am," then he turned to Jacob, his expression grave. "Silas Crawford has been to my property. Yesterday. He came with 2 deputies and a surveyor." Jacob felt cold settle in his stomach. "What did he want?" "He claimed my eastern boundary extends 20 feet onto your property. Said the original survey was incorrect and needs to be corrected. He showed me maps, measurements, all very official looking." Thomas met Jacob's eyes. "But here is the problem, Jacob. If his measurements are correct, then my fence and part of my barn sit on your land, which means I have been occupying property that does not belong to me." "That makes no sense," Jacob said. "We walked those boundaries together when you filed your claim. We both agreed on the markers." "I know," Thomas replied, "but Crawford says the territorial survey takes precedence over our private agreement. He says if I do not move my structures off your property within 30 days, he will declare my homestead in violation and seize it for illegal encroachment." Jacob understood immediately. This was not about Thomas at all. This was Crawford setting a trap. "He wants you to come to me asking permission to keep your structures where they are. He wants me to grant you an easement or sell you the disputed strip of land." "Why would that matter?" Winter Moon asked, following the conversation with difficulty. "Because," Jacob explained, his jaw tight, "if I grant Thomas an easement, Crawford will claim I am subdividing my property without proper authorization. That violates the Homestead Act requirement to work the land as a single continuous claim. And if I sell Thomas the disputed land, Crawford will claim I am engaging in commercial land speculation, which also violates homestead requirements." He looked at Thomas. "Either way, Crawford gets grounds to challenge my claim." "I am sorry, Jacob," Thomas said heavily. "I think he is using me to get at you. If I refuse to move my structures, he seizes my land. If you help me, he seizes yours. We are both trapped." Jacob walked to the window and stared out at the falling snow. Crawford had planned this carefully. The land commissioner was applying legal pressure from multiple angles, looking for any weakness he could exploit. And he had found one. Friendship, neighborly obligation, the natural human impulse to help someone in need. "Do not move your structures," Jacob said finally. "Jacob, if I do not, I lose everything." "You will not lose anything," Jacob replied, turning back. "Because Crawford's survey is false. It has to be. We marked those boundaries accurately. I have the original survey maps from when I filed my claim. They show the exact position of every marker stone we placed." "Crawford says his survey supersedes the original," Thomas said. "Then we get a third survey done. An independent surveyor not employed by the Territorial Land Office. Someone with no connection to Crawford." Jacob's mind worked through the possibilities. There is a federal surveyor in Denver. He works for the Land Management Office, completely separate from the territorial system. If we can get him to conduct a survey, his findings will carry more weight than Crawford's. "That will cost money," Thomas said. "Federal surveyors do not work for free." "How much?" "Probably $50, maybe more." Jacob had exactly $63 in his savings, money set aside for seed and supplies for spring planting. Spending 50 would leave him dangerously short, but losing the land would cost him everything. I will pay for it. We get the federal survey done, prove Crawford is lying, and that ends his challenge. Or, Thomas said quietly, it just makes him angry enough to find another way to come at you. Probably, Jacob agreed. But at least this way we are fighting him openly instead of letting him pick us off one at a time. After Thomas left, Wintermoon helped Jacob prepare a letter to the federal surveyor in Denver, requesting his services and offering payment. Jacob would ride to Fort Collins the next day to post it. With luck, the surveyor could arrive within 2 weeks. That night, as Jacob lay by the stove trying to sleep, he heard soft footsteps. Wintermoon emerged from the bedroom, moving quietly to avoid waking Morning Star. She sat down on the floor beside him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cold. You give your money to help neighbor, she said softly. Money you need for spring. Thomas is a good man, Jacob replied, and Crawford is using him to hurt me. I cannot let that happen. You are a good man too, Wintermoon said. She was quiet for a moment, then continued. When Swift Eagle die, I think all good men die with him. I think world only have men like Blackwood and Crawford. Men who take and hurt and never give. She looked at Jacob in the dim firelight. You show me I am wrong. You show me good men still exist. Jacob did not know how to respond to that. He had not thought of himself as good or bad in a long time. He had simply existed, moving through days without purpose or hope. But Wintermoon's words touched something in him that had been dormant for 3 years. I am just doing what needs to be done, he said finally. No, Wintermoon replied. You do more than need. You do what is right. That is different. She hesitated, then reached out and placed her hand over his. I am grateful. For everything. Her hand was warm and small in his. Jacob turned his palm up, letting their fingers interlace. They sat like that in the quiet darkness, not speaking, simply present with each other. It was not passion or romance. Not yet. It was something simpler and more profound. Connection. Understanding. Two people who had been alone finding they did not have to be anymore. You should sleep, Jacob said eventually. Morning Star will wake early. Wintermoon nodded but did not immediately move. Jacob, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. What happens if Crawford wins? If he takes your land? He will not, Jacob replied with more confidence than he felt. But if he does? Jacob considered the question seriously. Then we leave. Together. All three of us. We go somewhere Crawford's authority does not reach. Montana territory maybe, or Oregon. Somewhere we can start over. You would leave your home? This place you build with Catherine? Catherine is gone, Jacob said, and the words hurt less than they once had. Samuel is gone. This land is just dirt and wood and stone. What matters is the people who share it with me. He squeezed her hand gently. I will not let Crawford or Blackwood take you and Morning Star. If keeping you safe means leaving this place, then that is what I will do. Tears glistened in Wintermoon's eyes. She leaned forward and rested her forehead against his shoulder, a gesture of trust and gratitude. Jacob put his arm around her, holding her carefully, aware of how fragile this moment was. They stayed like that until the fire burned low and cold seeped back into the cabin. Then Wintermoon returned to the bedroom, and Jacob settled back onto his blanket. But sleep came easier than it had in weeks, and his dreams were not haunted by loss for the first time in memory. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Jacob saddled Sherman for the ride to Fort Collins, the letter to the federal surveyor tucked safely in his coat pocket. Wintermoon handed him a cloth bundle containing bread and dried meat for the journey. Be careful, she said. Crawford knows you go to town. He might try something. I will watch the road, Jacob promised. He looked down at Morning Star, who stood beside her mother wearing a coat Wintermoon had sewn from one of Jacob's old shirts. You take care of your mother while I am gone. Morning Star nodded solemnly. I will, Papa Jacob. The words struck him like a physical blow. Papa Jacob. The child had been calling him that for days now, but each time it landed with the same force, filling hollow places in his chest he thought would remain empty forever. He knelt down and pulled her into a brief hug, then mounted Sherman and rode east toward Fort Collins. The road was muddy from snowmelt, making for slow travel. Jacob kept alert, scanning the horizon for any sign of riders, but the journey passed without incident. He posted the letter at the Fort Collins office, paid for priority delivery, then stopped at the general store to purchase coffee and sugar. Mrs. Abigail Hartford, the store owner, greeted him warmly. "Jacob Thornhill," she said, smiling. "I heard you have guests staying at your place." News traveled fast in small communities. "I do," Jacob confirmed. "Winter Moon and her daughter. They work my homestead under legal contract." Mrs. Hartford's expression grew more serious. "Silas Crawford was in here yesterday asking questions about you, wanting to know if you were keeping up your property, if anyone had seen signs of neglect or abandonment." "What did you tell him?" "I told him your homestead is the best maintained in the valley and he should mind his own business," Mrs. Hartford replied tartly. She was a widow in her late 50s who had run her store successfully for 20 years and took no nonsense from anyone, even land commissioners. "But Jacob, be careful. Crawford is a vindictive man. He does not like being defied." "I know," Jacob said. "Thank you for the warning." He was loading his purchases onto Sherman when he heard his name called. Turning, he saw Ezra Blackwood standing outside the saloon across the street, flanked by two of his men. The buffalo hunter looked like he had been drinking, his face flushed, and his movements slightly unsteady. "Thornhill," Blackwood called loudly, drawing the attention of people on the street. "I hear you filed papers claiming Winter Moon as your property. Funny how you told me I could not own her, but you can." Jacob kept his hand near his Colt but did not draw. "She is not my property. She is my employee, working under legal contract. There is a difference." "The difference is you have a piece of paper and I do not," Blackwood sneered. He walked closer, his men following. "But paper burns, Thornhill, and when it does, that Indian bitch will belong to whoever is strong enough to take her." "Watch your mouth," Jacob said, his voice dropping to a dangerous quiet. Blackwood grinned, sensing he had struck a nerve. "Or what? You will shoot me in the middle of town? In front of all these witnesses?" He gestured to the gathered crowd. "No, I think you will do nothing, because you are a coward hiding behind laws and contracts instead of settling this like a man." Jacob forced himself to remain calm. Blackwood was trying to provoke him into a fight, probably hoping Jacob would throw the first punch so Blackwood could claim self-defense when he retaliated. It was a transparent tactic, but effective if Jacob let anger override judgment. "I have no quarrel with you, Blackwood," Jacob said evenly. "Winter Moon owes you nothing. Her husband owed you nothing. Your claim is false, and we both know it." "My claim is whatever I say it is," Blackwood replied, "and I say that squaw is mine. The law can say different all it wants, but out here the law is just words on paper. Reality is what men with guns make it." "Then reality is this," Jacob said. "If you come to my property again, if you threaten Winter Moon or her daughter again, I will kill you, not wound you, not scare you, kill you. That is not a threat. It is a promise." The crowd had gone silent. Blackwood's grin faded. For a moment, violence hung in the air between them like smoke. Then one of Blackwood's men tugged at his sleeve, whispering something urgent. Blackwood spat on the ground near Jacob's boots, then turned and walked back toward the saloon. "We will see, Thornhill. We will see." Jacob finished loading his supplies and mounted Sherman, riding out of town with his back straight and his awareness sharp. He half expected Blackwood to follow and ambush him on the road, but the buffalo hunter apparently had enough sense not to commit murder in broad daylight. The ride home took until late afternoon. As Jacob crested the final ridge before his valley, he saw something that made his heart stop. Smoke. Too much smoke. Not from a chimney, but from a structure burning. He spurred Sherman into a gallop, racing down the slope toward his homestead. As he drew closer, he saw that the smoke came from his barn. Flames engulfed the structure, consuming hay and wood with terrifying speed. Winter Moon stood in the yard with Morning Star, both of them staring at the inferno. When she heard Jacob approach, Winter Moon turned, her face streaked with tears and soot. "I am sorry," she called out. "I try to stop it. I try." Jacob dismounted and ran to them, checking both for injuries. "Are you hurt, either of you?" "No," Winter Moon said, "but barn is gone. I am so sorry, Jacob." "What happened?" Jacob asked, pulling them both back from the heat of the flames. "Men come," Winter Moon explained, her voice shaking. 3 men, not Blackwood. Different. They say they are deputies with warrant to search property." I show them contract. They laugh. They say contract is fake. Then they go to barn and light fire. They say this is what happens to people who hide Indians. Jacob felt rage boil through him, hot and fierce. Crawford. This had Crawford's mark all over it, sending men to intimidate and destroy while maintaining deniability. The barn was gone, a total loss. All his tools, his feed stores, his equipment, hundreds of dollars in value turned to ash. But Winter Moon and Morning Star were safe. That was what mattered. He held them both as they watched the barn collapse in on itself, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. The flames reflected in Morning Star's wide eyes, and Jacob felt something harden inside him. This had gone beyond legal maneuvering. Crawford had escalated to destruction and intimidation, which meant the gloves were off. "We are going to fight this," Jacob said quietly. "We are going to fight Crawford and Blackwood and anyone else who tries to take what is ours. Do you understand? We are not running. We are not giving up. We stand and fight." Winter Moon looked up at him, her face illuminated by firelight. "Together, boy." "Together," Jacob confirmed. As full darkness fell and the barn fire burned down to glowing embers, Jacob made plans. He would rebuild. He would document everything. He would gather witnesses. And he would make sure that Crawford and his hired thugs faced consequences for what they had done. The war had taught Jacob many things. One of them was that sometimes peaceful men had to become dangerous to protect what mattered. He had tried to avoid that transformation, had tried to solve this through legal means. But if Crawford wanted war, then war he would get. Jacob stood with his arms around Winter Moon and Morning Star, watching his barn burn, and made a silent promise to Catherine's memory and Samuel's grave. He would not lose this family the way he had lost the last one. Whatever it took, whatever price he had to pay, he would keep them safe. The storm had arrived. Now came the thunder. The federal surveyor arrived 11 days after the barn burned. His name was Henry Caldwell, a precise man in his 60s who carried his instruments with the care of a surgeon handling scalpels. Jacob met him at the boundary between his land and Thomas Hensley's property, both homesteaders watching as Caldwell set up his theodolite and began the painstaking work of measurement. It took 3 days. Caldwell measured angles, calculated distances, referenced old survey markers that predated both homesteads. He worked with methodical slowness, checking each calculation twice, making notes in a leather-bound journal. On the third day, he called Jacob and Thomas together. "Commissioner Crawford's survey is incorrect," Caldwell said flatly, showing them his maps. "By approximately 40 feet. The disputed strip of land belongs entirely to Jacob Thornhill's claim. Thomas Hensley's structures sit well within his own boundaries. There is no encroachment." Relief flooded through Jacob. "You are certain?" "I have been surveying for the federal government for 32 years, Caldwell replied. "I am certain. I will submit my official report to the Land Management Office in Denver with copies to the territorial governor and the Fort Collins Land Office. Commissioner Crawford's challenge has no merit." After Caldwell departed, Thomas gripped Jacob's hand firmly. "You saved my homestead. I will not forget that." "Crawford was using you to get at me," Jacob said. "Fighting him helped us both." But as he rode back to his cabin, Jacob knew that defeating Crawford's survey challenge would not end the conflict. If anything, it would make the land commissioner more dangerous. Men like Crawford did not accept defeat gracefully. He found Winter Moon in the yard, hanging laundry on lines she had strung between trees. Morning Star played nearby, building elaborate structures from sticks and stones. The scene was so domestic, so peaceful, that Jacob felt his chest tighten with an emotion he had almost forgotten. Hope. "The surveyor finished," Jacob called out as he dismounted. "Crawford's claim is false. We won." Winter Moon dropped the wet shirt she was holding and ran to him, her face alight with joy. She threw her arms around him without thinking, and Jacob caught her, holding her close. They stood like that for a long moment, her face pressed against his chest, his arms wrapped around her shoulders. When she pulled back, her cheeks were flushed with embarrassment at her boldness. "I am sorry. I should not." "Do not apologize," Jacob said softly. He reached up and gently tucked a strand of black hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering on her cheek. "You have nothing to be sorry for." Their eyes met and held. In that moment, Jacob understood that what existed between them had grown beyond partnership or alliance. It had become something neither of them had been looking for, but both desperately needed. A connection forged in shared struggle, in mutual protection, in the quiet intimacy of two damaged people learning to trust again. Jacob, Wintermoon said, her voice barely above a whisper, I am afraid. Of what? Of this feeling, of caring for someone again. When Swift Eagle die, I think my heart die too. I think I never feel safe with man again. But with you, she trailed off, searching for words in her still developing English. With you, I feel home. Jacob cupped her face in both hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she had not realized were falling. I know. I feel it too. And it terrifies me because I thought I would never care about anyone again after Catherine and Samuel. But you and Morning Star, you have given me a reason to wake up in the morning, a reason to fight, a reason to believe that life can be more than just surviving. He leaned down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away. She did not. Their lips met in a kiss that was gentle and tentative at first, then deepened as 3 years of loneliness and loss found expression in that single moment of connection. When they finally separated, both were breathing hard. Morningstar had stopped playing and was watching them with wide eyes. Mama kissed Papa Jacob, she announced, delighted. Wintermoon laughed, the sound like water over stones, clear and bright. Yes, little one. Mama kissed Papa Jacob. That evening, after Morningstar had been put to bed, Jacob and Wintermoon sat at the table with Catherine's Bible open between them. But they were not reading scripture. They were looking at the blank pages at the back where families traditionally recorded births, marriages, and deaths. I want to do this right, Jacob said. Not just a contract or an arrangement, a real marriage, legal and binding in every way. How we do that? Wintermoon asked. I am Comanche. Some people not accept. Reverend Pierce will marry us, Jacob replied. He already signed the contract. He knows our situation. And once we are married, you become a citizen through me. That gives you even more legal protection than the work contract. Wintermoon was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the empty lines on the Bible's family page. You are sure marriage is forever. You cannot take it back if you change mind. I am sure, Jacob said. He took her hand, intertwining their fingers. I want you as my wife. I want Morningstar as my daughter. I want us to be a family, not because the law requires it or because we need protection, but because that is what we choose, what I choose. Tears spilled down Wintermoon's cheeks. I choose it too. I choose you. They sat in silence for a while, hands clasped, the enormity of their decisions settling over them like a blessing. Outside, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Inside, two people who had lost everything began to believe they might have found something worth keeping. Reverend Pierce returned 2 weeks later, and this time he brought witnesses. Thomas and Martha Hensley, Mrs. Abigail Hartford from the general store, and Dr. Henry Mitchell, who served the scattered homesteads as physician. They gathered in front of Jacob's cabin on a cold December morning, their breath clouding in the air. Wintermoon wore a simple dress that Martha Hensley had sewn for her, dark blue with white lace at the collar. Morningstar stood beside her mother wearing a smaller version of the same dress, holding a bouquet of dried wildflowers they had gathered and preserved for this day. Jacob wore his best suit, the one he had been married in before, the one he had worn to bury Catherine and Samuel. But today it felt different, not like a memorial to the past, but like a bridge to the future. Pierce opened his Bible and began the ceremony. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. His voice carried across the yard, formal and solemn. Marriage is not to be entered into lightly, but reverently, deliberately, and in accordance with the purposes for which it was instituted by God. Jacob barely heard the familiar words. His attention was fixed on Wintermoon's face, on the way the morning light caught in her dark eyes, on the slight trembling of her hands as she held his. Jacob Thornhill, Pierce said, do you take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part? I do, Jacob said, his voice steady and sure. Winter Moon, Pierce continued, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health until death do you part? I do, Winter Moon replied in clear English, the words she had practiced for days. Jacob slipped the ring onto her finger. It was Catherine's ring, the one he had removed from her hand before burial, the one he had kept in a drawer for 3 years unable to look at it. But last night he had taken it to the hill where Catherine and Samuel rested, and he had spoken to them in the darkness. Catherine, I hope you understand. I am not forgetting you. I am not replacing you. But I am choosing to live again, to love again, to build something new from the ruins of what we lost. I think you would approve of her. She is strong like you were, brave like you were, and she needs someone to protect her the way I could not protect you. He had placed his hand on Samuel's grave marker. And Samuel, you would have loved Morning Star. She is curious and fearless, just like you were. I promised to be the father to her that I could not be to you for long enough. Now, as he looked at the ring on Winter Moon's hand, he felt Catherine's blessing rather than her ghost. The past and future had made their peace. By the power vested in me by the territory of Colorado, Pierce declared, I now pronounce you man and wife. Jacob, you may kiss your bride. Jacob pulled Winter Moon close and kissed her as their small circle of witnesses applauded. Morning Star jumped up and down, clapping her hands with delight. Mama married. Papa Jacob married. After the ceremony, they shared a simple meal that Martha Hensley had prepared. Mrs. Hartford produced a small cake, a luxury that must have cost her dearly. Dr. Mitchell offered a toast with coffee since none of them drank spirits. To Jacob and Winter Moon, may your union bring you the peace and happiness you both deserve. As the sun began to set and their guests prepared to depart, Thomas Hensley pulled Jacob aside. There is something you should know. Silas Crawford has been asking questions around town again. This time about your marriage, whether it is legal for a white man to marry a Comanche woman. It is legal, Jacob said. Federal law does not prohibit interracial marriage. Crawford is not concerned with federal law, Thomas replied. He is looking for any angle he can use. Be careful, Jacob. Winning the survey battle only made him more determined. After everyone left, Jacob stood with Winter Moon and Morning Star, watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of orange and purple. The child was already calling him Papa without the Jacob now, and each time it happened, something in Jacob's chest grew warmer. What happens now? Winter Moon asked, leaning against his side. Now we rebuild, Jacob said. The barn first, then we prepare for spring planting. We work the land, we raise Morning Star, we live. And Crawford, Blackwood? They will keep trying, Jacob admitted. Men like that do not give up easily, but we have something they do not. We have the law on our side now, truly and completely. You are my legal wife. Morning Star is my legal daughter. This is our legal home, and I will defend it with everything I have. Winter Moon turned to face him, her hands resting on his chest. I love you, Jacob Thornhill. I not know how to say it good in English, but I feel it here. She placed his hand over her heart. You saved my life. You saved Morning Star's life. You give us home when we have nothing. You are good man. Best man I ever know. I love you too, Jacob said, the words coming easier than he expected. You and Morning Star, you saved me just as much as I saved you. You gave me a reason to care about tomorrow again. That night, for the first time, Jacob did not sleep by the stove. He shared the bed with his wife, holding her as she slept, marveling at the strange path that had brought them to this moment. Morning Star slept on a small cot they had made for her in the corner, her iron horse clutched in one small hand. The grandfather clock chimed midnight, then 1, then 2. Jacob lay awake, listening to the breathing of his new family, and felt something he had thought lost forever. Contentment. Not the absence of problems or challenges, but the presence of purpose and love strong enough to face whatever came. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived from the territorial governor's office. The federal surveyor's report had been reviewed and accepted. Silas Crawford's challenge to Jacob's homestead boundaries was officially dismissed. Furthermore, the governor's office had opened an investigation into Crawford's conduct. including the unauthorized use of deputies to harass and intimidate homesteaders. Crawford himself appeared at Jacob's property one final time, riding up alone on a cold January morning. Jacob met him in the yard, rifle in hand, but not aimed. "You have won, Thornhill," Crawford said, his voice bitter. "For now, but this territory is changing. More people coming every year. More pressure on resources. Men who marry Indians, who give them equal standing with white settlers. You make it harder for the rest of us to maintain order and civilization." "Order and civilization," Jacob repeated. "Is that what you call stealing land and burning barns?" Crawford's jaw tightened. "I did what I thought necessary to preserve the natural hierarchy of this territory, but apparently the governor disagrees." He looked past Jacob toward the cabin where Winter Moon stood in the doorway, Morning Star on her hip. "You think you have beaten me, but you have only delayed the inevitable. This land will belong to men like me eventually. The Indians will be gone. The half-breeds will be sent away, and homesteaders who defy the natural order will find themselves with nothing. Then I will fight that day when it comes," Jacob said. "The same way I fought you, with the law, with witnesses, and with the determination to protect my family from men who believe power gives them the right to destroy others." Crawford stared at him for a long moment, then turned his horse and rode away. Jacob watched until he disappeared over the ridge, then lowered his rifle and returned to the cabin. "Is it over?" Winter Moon asked. "For now," Jacob replied. He set the rifle aside and pulled her into an embrace. "Crawford's power is broken. The investigation will keep him occupied. Blackwood has not been seen in weeks. We have breathing room." "But not forever?" "No," Jacob admitted. "Not forever. The world is changing, and not always for the better. But we will face it together, as a family." Morningstar tugged at Jacob's pant leg. "Papa, you promised to teach me letters today." Jacob smiled and scooped her up. "So I did. Let us begin your lesson." As he sat at the table with Morningstar, showing her how to form the letters of her name, Winter Moon worked at the stove preparing their midday meal. The cabin was warm, filled with the sounds of a family going about their daily routines. It was ordinary, unremarkable, and more precious than gold. That evening, Jacob took his wife and daughter to the hill behind the cabin, where two headstones marked the resting place of Catherine and Samuel. He had brought Winter Moon here before, but this time felt different. This time he was bringing his family to meet his family. "Catherine, Samuel," Jacob said softly, kneeling between the graves. "I want you to meet someone. This is Winter Moon, my wife. And this is Morningstar, my daughter now." Winter Moon knelt beside him, placing fresh flowers on both graves. "Thank you," she said, speaking to the stones as if to living people. "Thank you for teaching Jacob how to love, how to protect, how to be good man. I promise to honor your memory by loving him with all my heart." Morningstar, too young to fully understand death, but sensing the solemnity of the moment, placed her iron horse on Samuel's grave. "For my brother," she said simply. Jacob felt tears on his face but did not wipe them away. These were not tears of grief, but of gratitude. Gratitude for the past he had survived, for the present he had earned, and for the future that stretched before him full of possibility. As they walked back to the cabin hand in hand, the sun setting behind them, Jacob looked at his land with new eyes. The barn would be rebuilt. The fields would be planted. Children would grow and learn and eventually have children of their own. And someday when he was old and gray, he would sit in a chair and tell his grandchildren the story of how their grandmother had appeared in his barn one desperate night and how that moment had changed everything. The legacy he would leave would not be measured in acres or gold, but in the family he had protected, the love he had nurtured, and the courage he had shown in choosing hope over despair. The grandfather clock chimed 6 times as they entered the cabin. Winter Moon began preparing supper, while Morningstar practiced her letters at the table. Jacob sat in his chair and watched them, his heart full. He had lost everything once, but he had found it again, in a different form, with different faces, but no less precious. Perhaps more so because this time he understood how fragile happiness could be, how easily it could slip away if not cherished and protected. "Papa," Morningstar called, "how do you spell family?" Jacob smiled and moved to sit beside her. "Family," he spelled out, watching her carefully form each letter. Family, the most important word you will ever learn. 42 years later, spring 1920, an old man sat in a rocking chair on the porch of a sturdy Colorado homestead, his weathered hands resting on a carved wooden cane. Jacob Thornhill was 81 years old now, his hair white as snow, his face lined with the marks of a life fully lived. But his eyes remained sharp, clear, watching the valley he had protected for so long. Beside him in her own chair sat Winter Moon, 69 years old, her black hair now streaked with silver, braided in the traditional Comanche way she had never abandoned. Her hands worked steadily at a piece of beadwork, creating patterns she would teach to her granddaughters. The yard before them was alive with motion. 4 grown children moved between the house and barn. Sarah, their eldest at 42, named for Catherine and carrying her grandmother's kindness. Thomas, 40, built like his father and working the forge behind the rebuilt barn. Elizabeth, 38, tending the garden with her mother's knowledge of herbs. And young Jacob, 35, checking the irrigation channels with an engineer's precision. Around them ran 9 grandchildren, ranging from age 5 to 18, their laughter filling the air with a sound that never grew old. The oldest, Catherine Marie, led her younger cousins in a game near the creek, just as Samuel might have done. A boy of 7 approached the porch, curiosity bright in his eyes. "Grandpa," he asked, settling at Jacob's feet, "Grandma says you two met a long time ago. How did it happen?" Jacob smiled, exchanging a glance with Winter Moon. She nodded, setting aside her beadwork. "Well, William," Jacob began, his voice still strong despite his years. "It started with footprints in the dust and a little girl who needed help. Your grandmother appeared in my barn one desperate night, her daughter sick and dying, with nowhere left to run." "And you saved them?" William asked. "No," Winter Moon interjected gently. "We saved each other." Jacob reached across and took his wife's hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of 4 decades of partnership. "The best decision I ever made," he said, "was choosing kindness over fear, choosing to protect those who needed protection, choosing love when the world said I should choose differently." Sarah emerged from the house carrying a tray of lemonade. Morning star, still beautiful at 46, now a school teacher in Fort Collins, fighting to ensure children of all backgrounds received education. She had never forgotten the nights her mother taught her letters by lamplight, or the man who had given them both a future. "Papa," she said, using the name she had claimed 42 years ago. "Mama, the photographer from town is here. He wants to take a picture of the whole family." Jacob stood, slowly, Winter Moon rising beside him. They walked together into the yard where their children and grandchildren gathered. 4 generations, if you counted the spirits of Catherine and Samuel watching from the hill. A legacy built not on land or gold, but on the choice one man had made to see humanity in those the world had deemed invisible. The photographer arranged them in rows, Jacob and Winter Moon at the center, surrounded by children and grandchildren, all of them living proof that love could bridge any divide, that family was defined not by blood alone, but by choice and courage and commitment. "Everyone ready?" the photographer called. "Hold still now." As the flash powder ignited, capturing that moment forever on film, Jacob thought about the long road from that November night in 1878 to this spring morning in 1920. Every struggle, every victory, every quiet moment of grace. He had lost everything once, and he had found everything again. "Papa Jacob," little William tugged at his sleeve after the photograph, "tell us more about the old days. About the buffalo hunters and the barn fire and how you fought the bad men." Jacob looked at Winter Moon. She smiled, that same smile that had grown from fear to trust to love over 4 decades. "Let me tell you about legacy," Jacob said, gathering the children close. "A man's legacy isn't his land or his gold or even the things he builds. It's the people he protects, the love he leaves behind, the courage he passes on to those who come after." He gestured to the valley, to the homestead that now sprawled across 1,000 acres, worked by 3 generations. "This land will remain long after I'm gone, but what matters is that you remember why it matters. We fought for this place not because of the dirt and water, but because it was where we chose to build something that would last, where we chose family over fear." The sun climbed higher over the Colorado mountains. Inside the house, dinner preparations began. The old barn Jacob had rebuilt after the fire still stood strong. The creek still flowed, feeding the valley that had once been contested and was now home to a family that had overcome everything the world had thrown at them. That evening, as the family gathered around a table that had been expanded many times to accommodate growing numbers, Jacob looked at the faces surrounding him. Children, grandchildren, all of them here because one desperate woman had stumbled into his barn and one lonely man had chosen compassion over convenience. To family, he said, raising his glass of water. To family, they echoed. And the grandfather clock in the corner, the same one that had chimed through every moment of their story, marked another hour in a legacy that would endure long after its ticking stopped. Outside, the stars emerged one by one over the Colorado sky. Inside, 3 generations sat together in warmth and love, living proof that even from the darkest night, even from the deepest loss, hope could grow strong enough to last forever. And that was legacy enough for any man.